You so much for being here virtually.
Pleasure.
And we also have Professor Noerhadi Magetsari, or Pak Nanung, and Professor Irmawati Johan, or Bu Irma. Both Pak Nanung and Bu Irma are museology lecturer at the Department of Archaeology, University of Indonesia. This webinar today actually is the part of museology program at the master level in the university, and Paul is one of the lecture at museology in University of Technology Sydney. Paul will talk about museology museum in 21st century, and probably he also will mention about the program in UTS 10 or 20 years ago. Before we begin, I would like to introduce to you all Professor Paul Ashton. I don't want to read all your CV, Paul. It's almost 10 pages. So, Professor Paul Ashton is a co-founder of the Australian Centre for Public History at the University of Technology Sydney in 1999. He's the editor of the journal Public History Review and the author of and co-author of editor and co-editor of 25 books and textbooks and 10 textbooks. He taught museum in UTS Public History Master Program for 10 years, and then undertook with Paul Hamilton National Study on Australia and the past, which is part survey museum and museum audiences in Australia under the Australian Research Council grant. And he has created 2 small exhibitions. Paul is also chair of the board of the Digital Dictionary of Sydney, and most recent concern the history of fruit shop in Sydney from the early 20th century. It was on exhibition at the City of Sydney Custom Halls for 6 months in 2010, and traveled to regional museum for next 2 years. Paul has visited dozens of national, regional, local, and specialist museums all over the world, and written numerous museum reviews. And Paul recently received the annual History Citation Award from History Council of New South Wales. Yeah. Congratulations for this, Paul. This is Australia for his lifelong achievement on history. So before we begin the talks and for the audience to know more about Paul, I would like to share to you all the video presentation of the awards as our appreciation of Professor Paul Ashton. So it will be 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, videonya.
Thank you.
Hang on, Paul.
Okay.
This is the video first.
Great.
Now we come to the annual history citation. And with me in the studio tonight, award.
Thanks, Stephen. The annual History Citation presentation commenced in 1997, and since that time, it's been awarded every year to an eminent historian in New South Wales to honour their lifetime of service to history. The citation recognises individuals for their outstanding research and scholarship and acknowledges their broader contribution also through teaching, leadership, mentoring and community involvement. And so, without further ado, I'm very honoured to present the annual History Citation for 2020 to Professor Paul Ashton. Hi Paul,
Hi,
congratulations.
Kira. Thank you very much.
There you are, there's your award.
Great, thank
Now,
you very much.
I've got a wonderful citation to read which is all about you, and I think people need to know about it, so I'd like to read it out.
Please do.
All right. The annual History Citation awarded by the History Council of New South Wales recognises and honours an individual who has made a significant and a lifelong contribution to the contribution and practice of history. For 2020, the History Council of New South Wales is very pleased to award this citation to you in recognition of your outstanding contribution to the study of Australian history and the international practice of public history. Paul, you graduated from Macquarie University in 1982 with an honours and then a PhD in 1999. You became an independent public historian with your own business for over 10 years before you were appointed to the Public History program at the University of Technology in Sydney. From that base, you became the editor of the first public history journal in Australia, which is the Public History Review, and it's still running. In 1999, you also co-founded and subsequently co-directed the Australian Centre for Public History at UTS, the University of Technology, Sydney, which is an essential companion to the Masters in Public History and the many successful research degree students who followed on. Paul, you have been incredibly generous with your time and constantly assisting younger scholars, such as myself and many others, and professional historians through formal and informal means. You've been a judge of the New South Wales Premier History Awards 5 times, and you've had over 30 doctoral student completions while at UTS, and you're still supervising doctoral candidates. And you've also contributed to the infrastructure of history in New South Wales. You've been involved with the Sydney History Group, with the Professional Historians Association. You were one of the founding members of this History Council of New South Wales, and you've also been very involved in the Dictionary of Sydney. You are still involved with UTS and the University of Canberra and Macquarie University. And on top of all of those incredible things, you've also somehow found time to author, co-author and edit 25 books and textbooks, including, more recently, 28 short creative non-history books for children. I mean, it's extraordinary. You've just sort of covered the whole range of things. So what is it that you most love about history?
I really am passionate about public history. It really is my big thing. I've made it my purpose in professional life to get public history out there and work with students who are also out in the community and in cultural institutions to push the word and to democratise the practice of history. Yeah,
so it's all about history for the public, by the public.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what is it that you think that historians really need to be able to do their job and do it well?
I think they need to be democratic and egalitarian, but they need to be very good communicators and to engage really carefully with communities.
Mm. And so, given that you've got such a breadth and depth of an understanding of history from an academic point of view, from a public point of view, working and a committee point of view, and you've sort of seen it change so much. What would you say are some of the key changes that have happened over the last 10 or so years? And sniffing the wind of the future, where do you think we're going next?
I think historical practice has, well, democratised a huge amount in the last decade or two, but it's also become more creative. I think a lot of historians have let their hair down and have become more imaginative in the way in which they present history. the children's, the non-fiction history children's books that I've been doing have been absolutely liberating.
Yeah.
And it's given me an opportunity to reach an audience that I haven't reached before. And I only see good things in the future. I think the professional historians are going to grow and prosper.
So I hear you saying that the future of history can be creative and fun, as well as for and with the public.
Absolutely, absolutely. If it's not fun, we don't want to do it.
And that's why I think you've been awarded the citation this year, because you've helped make it that way for so many of us. So on behalf of the History Council of New South Wales and all people who love history in New South Wales, I'd like to congratulate you very much for this extremely well-earned award.
Thank you so
Paul.
much, Kira. That's
Thank
lovely.
you.
Again from Austria. This is very
Congratulations, Paul.
Thank you.
Before we begin, probably the committee will be presenting the regulation for the audience. Hang on, Paul. Okay. The presentation will be last for 45 to 60 minutes. It's up to you, Paul. And then there will be a question and answer. Okay, without further ado, let's begin the presentation by Professor Paul Ashton. Paul, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Pardon me, I've got a little bit of a cough at the moment, so excuse me if I just cough now and again. And Kresno, who I've worked with for many years now, I think I first met you in the late 90s.
Yep, Australian Studies Center.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yep. History has changed quite a bit, I think, since then. And I'm very honoured and pleased to have been invited to talk. So, Kresno, how long would you like me to talk for, ideally?
45 to 60 minutes, because I think you have a lot of PowerPoint. Do you able to share screen your presentation, or we do it from here?
If you do it from there in a few minutes, that would be great. That would be great.
Sure. Nanti. Okay, Paul.
That's great. So Kresno's asked me to talk about museums in the 21st century, and I'm going to use Australia as a case study, which I know more about than anything else. But I think it's probably important to give a bit of background, just a brief background to the development of museums in Australia before I'd start into the 21st century. The first museum in Australia was set up in 1827. It was the Australian Museum. It was largely ethnographic and geological. It was about identifying, classifying and mapping places, resources and people. And it was also ideological. It was about supporting ideologies that underpinned colonialism and imperialism. Things like the chain of being, with white Europeans at the top and Aborigines at the bottom. And other ideologies during the 19th century started being supported by museums and their displays and their collections. They were things like ideologies around exceptionalism, which America became very involved in. That's the idea about exceptionalism was that Europeans had a God-given right to spread their superior culture and throughout the world. Another ideology was progress, which is one of the most powerful ideologies in Australian history, that growth and development were natural and imperative. We've now come to a point where people don't really see those ideologies because they've become so naturalised. People don't see them as being ideological. So in the 19th century, there were By the end of the 19th century in Australia, there were major but very small museums in every colony, but they weren't terribly well resourced. We became a nation, or we federated in 1901, but our federation was fairly weak. It was a collection of squabbling colonies that all had to get together for various reasons to become a nation, well away from their British parent and their American cousin, so to speak. And museums in Australia in the first 30 or 40 years in the 20th century start building collections around nationalism. The Australian War Memorial, for example, they start building that in 1928, but it's not open till 1941. And you might want to pop the slideshow on now.
Yep.
Kresno, if you like,
sure.
that'd be great. Okay,
Hang on
thank
for a
you.
minute. Yep. Yep, here you go.
Thank you. Okay, so this is just a funny picture from the 1950s in Sydney, in Sutherland Shire, near where Captain Cook came onto Australian land in the first. This was a real museum, but it's absolutely wacky. It's got an Aborigine with a spear in the front, a whale bones in the front near the Aboriginal person. It just says a lot about what small local museums were like in Australia. Can we move on to the next slide?
Yep, next. Yep.
Thank you. So the War Memorial is under construction from 1928. It opens in 1941, but today it's become very controversial. It's become branded and very corporate, and the federal government is pushing a lot of its ideas about nationalism and Australia's place in the world through this, and it's caused a huge amount of controversy in Australia. There's groups of historians and soldiers groups who aren't happy with what's happening. And again, it's something that has become controversial. Okay, in the 1930s, we saw in Australia museums stagnate. The Depression left museums under-resourced, and it really wasn't until the 1970s that state and federal government here, the state, started to think about resourcing museums. And you might want to go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. This is Forbes Historical Society. A lot of smaller historical societies started growing around the 1920s and 30s as regional areas started to develop, as communities wanted some sort of roots, to find roots in their communities' historical roots. This is Forbes Historical Society, which is in the countryside in New South Wales, and part of its collection is around agricultural machinery, the development of farming, the development of the land in Australia. Okay, and if we could pop to the next slide.
Next.
Thank you. So in the 1970s, Australian cities had become very run down and quarantined. And our state governments and our federal government decided that they actually wanted to inject money into cultural facilities to actually attract tourists to the capital cities. And they put a lot of money into the 150th, the bicentenary of Cook's Landing in 1770, then into various bicentenaries leading up to the bicentenary in New South Wales in 1988. And the money put into these cultural institutions, and this isn't often recognised or acknowledged, but money was spent to build up places like the Powerhouse and the National Maritime Museum and other institutions to get cities like Sydney to become world-leading global cities that attracted people. So in 1988, for example, in Sydney, we see the establishment of the Australian Maritime Museum, the Powerhouse Museum, and a number of other smaller museums, including the Museum of Childhood. Other museums that grew up at this time were the South Australian Migration Museum. But again, a key role of these institutions was to engage with national identity, diversity and reconciliation. But as I mentioned earlier, another key and often unacknowledged role was to turn capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne into desirable global cities and to provide cultural attractions in other smaller cities like Adelaide. So today there are a broad range of museums that display history to a range of publics. There are local museums, such as the one we looked at Forbes, which vary enormously in their size and quality. Sovereign Hill at Ballarat in Victoria, for example, is a highly successful open-air museum. People can walk around and look at gold miners and people in colonial times doing things and watch blacksmiths using their forges and making shoes for horses. Here, visitors are invited to step back in time and experience the past personally and firsthand. It has a multi-million-dollar annual turnover now. I think it's in the over $10 million. Pardon me. If we could go to the next slide, that would be great. Some local historic societies who are reasonably well resourced also mount incredibly successful and sophisticated exhibitions which explore large themes through local areas. This is an exhibition that opened last year at the Fairfield City Museum and Gallery. It's a very interesting museum. It's primarily a museum. It's local and regional. It was set up in 1980 and it has very sophisticated exhibitions like the one here that was held on immigration. But over the years, this museum has actually demonstrated when you go on site, if we put the next slide on,
yep.
This is about Vietnamese immigration to Australia, but the next slide
yep.
Is about Muslim immigration from places like Iran and Iraq. And that was part of the same exhibition, which mixed art with history. And the artist here, who is a lawyer, mixes art with historical documents. That's her mother there in the photograph. It's part of her artwork. So if we move to the next slide.
Yep.
This is my great niece, Trinity, as part of the fair. This is the same gallery and museum, but this is from the 1980s. This is part of this institution that has grown over time. And if you visit there, you can see how approaches to museums and museology has evolved in Australia over 40, 50 years. So this is a very old-fashioned display of, old objects, no proper labelling, just an accumulation of objects. Okay, if we go to the next slide, thank you. The Parramatta Female Factory is an example of a museum that is specifically themed. This is located 20 kilometres west of Sydney. It's the Parramatta Female Factory precinct, and it covers an area of about 16 acres. It's the location of Australia's first purpose-built convict female factory in 1821, and it was where wayward women, naughty women were put in these institutions and trained to do useful work. They were like jails, basically. And this part of it became a Roman Catholic orphanage from 1888 to 1886. Part of it was a lunatic asylum from 1847. And the Parramatta Girls Industrial School set up there in 1887. From 1980 until 2010, the Norma Parker Detention Centre for Women was there. So this precinct is both an open museum where we can actually engage with the built environment and with trees that were planted hundreds of years ago. It's also a place where archived material is located, but it's also a gallery. There are some small gallery spaces that are historically based, but it's also houses museum exhibitions and installations. It's probably a very interesting example in Australia of the different ways that museums can operate with different audiences in different ways, using different materials, different spaces. And it's probably one of the most powerful places in Australia. If this, the site at the moment, there's a lot of controversy around it. Its future is not certain. If it was in a country like America, it would be a national historic site. But at the moment, it's in the middle of Sydney, in the middle of one of the biggest development areas in Sydney, and the politics around it is very complicated. But it can tell us much about Australian history and society and transnational connections to other parts of the world. It can tell us about the development of many things, including the welfare state in Australia, the evolution of silent systems of institutionalisation. It can tell us about medical history, but it can also tell us about the heritage industry, the development of urban history, and urban politics over a long period of time. It also, pardon me, raises the very important question that I've been talking and thinking about for a long time, and Michael Frisch has also been talking and thinking about for a long time, is that who has the authority to interpret and present the past? With this site, and we might move to the next slide.
Next.
Thank you.
Yep.
This is part of the site. It's a very big site. That's Bethel House. It's a gallery and a museum in the background, and this is Heritage Week in New South Wales, and thousands of people come to the site to look for ancestors, to look at the exhibitions, to walk around the site, to make contact with it. And again, it is very, very powerful. We can go to the next slide if you, thank you. Bonnie Durack, who is on the right-hand side in the brown jacket, was incarcerated in the Parramatta Female Factory in the 1970s. And she single-handedly has saved this site in the early mid-1980s. She jumped over one of those big stone walls, broke into some of the buildings and photographed them all. And in the last 30 years, she has almost single-handedly saved this huge area from being destroyed and developed as high-rise residential places. She was given an Order of Australia, a very high national award, a couple of years ago for her services to history and the community and to people who we call the forgotten generations. These are people who were institutionalised as children, abused, and had terrible treatment at the hands of both government and private institutions that were supposed to care for children and other people. So Bonnie has been a driving force here. She's an expert in understanding this place, and it's a very good argument for professional historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and archivists to work engaged with communities. Bonnie had a group of archaeologists that came to this site that were trying to read it, and a lot of the buildings had markings and initials and various other things scratched into different sorts of built fabric walls and wooden frames of doors, and none of them could interpret it. So it took Bonnie's knowledge and experience of actually being there to allow them to interpret this site and get a huge amount of rich detail and material out of it. Without her, a lot of the really significant cultural and social things tied up in this site no one would have known they were there. They would not have been recognised and they would have been lost. So the Parramatta Female Factory is a site of conscience. It's primarily concerned with publicly confronting past injustices and their impacts in the present and championing human rights. And they are places that draw on multiple practices, including heritage preservation, education, civic engagement, human rights, public art, and public history. And all of these work to a varying degree with memory. This site is now recognised as a site of conscience. It's currently the only one in Australia, and it's recognised by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. So moving on, there are a couple of national museums in Australia, quite a few. Some of these are themed, such as the National Museum, Maritime Museum in Sydney. And can we pop on to the next slide?
Next.
This, is part of the Parramatta Female Factory. This is a quilt where Bonnie and other people researched the names of children who died in the Roman Catholic orphanage between 1884 and 1886, and they've made quilts to remember the children in these places. If we could go to the next slide, would be great. Again, here I am a forgotten Australian, one of the sole survivors of the child welfare scandal in Australia's history. I withstood their scathing remarks and treatment, but like a thrower, I still stand tall. So again, these are quilts based on people's memories and recollections of their experience in these places. So if we could move on again.
Yep.
That would be great.
Next.
Okay. So in terms of national museums, we've had and have quite a few in Australia. We have the National Maritime Museum in Sydney. Most national museums, however, concentrate on identity and nationalism. In recent years, one of our national museums failed. This is the Museum of Australian Democracy at Eureka, MADE, which is in Ballarat in Victoria. It was moved there for political reasons. The visitation rate was far too small and it basically collapsed. And the collection here, if you want to move on to the next slide.
Next.
Thank you. So this is a part of one of the slightly interactive exhibitions in the museum about public protest and people's power. And if we want to move to the next slide. Okay. So this museum was closed down because of very small visitation numbers, and its collection was moved to the National Museum of Democracy in Canberra. Unfortunately, they dropped the E off the end of the acronym, so it went from MADE to MAD. It's a bit fitty. This is just a photograph I took of one of the exhibition displays about protest in the National Museum of Australian Democracy with how loud howlers and T-shirts with no war on Iran, and hands that are put in the ground around Parliament buildings to show support for protest or for issues. If we move on again.
Next.
Thank you. Again, protest badges, loud howlers, different forms of communicating opinions, which is in the background. And if we move on again. And this is my niece again, towards the end of this it's a very large museum with lots of different collections in the old Parliament House. So you get to see where Prime Ministers sat and where they slept in their kitchens. There are this area where you can sit, and these pillows say, how will you change the world? So it's a very proactive, engaged, interactive museum. So if we could go to next, that would be great.
Yep.
Okay. So this is the National Museum of Australia. I don't know if anyone has visited this place, but it's a very large museum. It's on a peninsula in Acton, in Canberra. So you approach it, it's on a large piece of land jutting into Lake Burley-Griffin. It's opened in 2000 and it has been very controversial. I wrote a review of the National Museum when it opened in 2000, and I called it a Trojan horse, the National Museum of Australia. And what I meant by the term a Trojan horse was that we ended up getting this really groovy, funky museum with lots of colours, very postmodern, but inside it was a lot of very old stories. So we thought we were going to get something new, but in fact, I'd argue that we didn't. So controversy surrounded the National Museum of Australia in the lead up to its opening in 2001, and for years after. This involved an inquiry into its approach to Australian history by the Howard Liberal government, and Liberal in Australia means Conservative. There were many media battles, and the first director, Dawn Casey, was sacked. And it reaffirmed, as have other recent debates about the role of the past in the present, that history matters. While battles over history in the media sometimes produce little more than sparks kept alive mainly in the minds of keenest observers, the National Museum in many ways represents a number of competing narratives and desires frozen, at least for a while in time. Some of these may not be immediately apparent, and many visitors may be more interested in seeing the heart of a famous racing horse or some national popular icon than pondering matters concerning nation identity and historical representation. But this state-of-the-art facility, with its marvellous collections, raises at least two fundamental questions about official public history practices. The first relates to the overarching type of history that is being attempted at the National Museum of Australia. Is it possible in the 21st century to construct an inclusive national narrative? The second question is, how well do museums do history? Scattered throughout most of the museum are signs of or hints of conflict and catastrophe in Australia's white past and present. And I just note that Indigenous people are primarily represented in the museum's largest permanent exhibition called First Australians, which is very good. Industrial disputes, environmental degradation. Our country is absolutely ravaged by environmental degradation, by soil erosion, river systems that have been destroyed. and by racial and other tensions, emerged through the various displays, at times forcefully, though generally subtly. But on my various visits to the institution, I was left with the impression that despite hardships and troubles, the march of progress in Australia had in the end been unimpeded. So going back to that idea of progress that was underpinning a lot of museums in the 19th century has continued through. All that had come before had contributed both to the forging of a truly Australian character and making Australia what it is today. That is a egalitarian, friendly, welcoming country. This indeed is what viewers are told in Snapshots of Australian History, which is an exhibition covering 1788 to 2000. Snapshots is indicative of a dislocation in the museum's dominant narrative, while revisionist in many respects. And by revisionist, I mean it takes a traditional story that leaves out women and mess and ethnic groups and political problems and just pops them back in without really changing the story too much. The main story it remains a traditional one. The learning experience is akin to reading a conservative school textbook. In this instance, we are taken quickly through convicts, governors, frontier conflict, voting, which echoes the museum's strong but unstated theme of citizenship, and then gold rushes, which Australia had, the end of convict transportation, through to the Depression, and so on, until the 1999 constitutional referendum to get rid of our monarchy and become a republic, which failed. Okay, I'll just skip through some of this. So defenders of museums like the National Museum might insist that I'm asking too much of such a cultural institution, or that my disappointment or criticisms might stem from a desire to see books on the wall. Others, such as former Prime Minister John Howard, may claim that I am asserting a bleak view of history. What I would like to see in the National Museum and other institutions like it, however, is more context and more balance. It may be possible to construct inclusive national narratives in the 21st century, but not at the National Museum of Australia. Official history, it seems, continues to dictate the limits of historical representation in these types of institutions. Gender blindness is still apparent in the museum, while minorities such as disabled and gay people have been largely displaced, continue to be excluded. Even the new nationalism, multiculturalism, appears to have been largely displaced by an older nationalism. And Australia claims to be a multicultural country. We have a lot of different nationalities, over 200, but we are a monocultural society in most ways in terms of our language and various other things. Could we move on to the next slide?
Next.
Thank you. And this is just a house museum in a wealthy suburb. It's an 1880s house called Carisbrook, and the historical society that owns it with the local council, local government council, decided to freeze it at 1 year in 1884. So everything in there is from the 1880s. And I've had meetings with them saying that they actually took things out of this museum that had been put in the 1910s and 20s and 50s and 80s. And I put the proposition to them that you could actually leave those things in situ to show how the museum has been used and changed over time, rather than trying to freeze it into 1 year or 1 decade. Okay, I'll just probably go for another 5 minutes,
Yep.
Kresno. Is that
Yes,
okay?
sure. No
Yeah,
worries.
thank
Yep.
you. Okay. There's a book that I reviewed a number of years ago in Recollections in the National Museum of Australia's very good journal. And that book was called Museum Revolutions. And I think it's a book that reflects a lot of the really good things about museums nationally and internationally, but also some of the continuing issues and problems that face museums. And I'll give you a very quick overview of the book, and then I'll stop. Museum Revolutions had its origins in a major international conference, which marked the 40th anniversary of the Department of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in England. And this, as I'm sure you all know, is one of the most important and influential academic museum departments in the world. It's where Elaine Hooper-Greenhill and Susan Pearce did most of their work. But it is not a conference collection. Rather, as the editors note, Museum Revolutions is a substantial and generally comprehensive text, but it's also a mirror onto the contemporary museum world. It has 28 chapters with 31 contributors from countries including Australia, Cameroon, England, France, India, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Scotland, Taiwan, and the United States. And it's divided into 3 parts. Part 1 looks at shaping museums and manifestos, and it largely looks at change and invention. Part 2 is called Changing Place, Changing People, and it concerns identity formation and politics and a sense of place. And the final 3rd part, Articulating Change, Media, Message, Philosophy, was devised to look at the ways in which museums attempt to investigate change in their publics. This part is the least coherent, and some of the chapters could have been moved around, but it's probably the most stimulating one. It actually starts looking at issues around revised wisdom as to traditions in museums about what audiences will read, how long labels should be, a whole lot of things. And a lot of these things are challenged by Fiona Cameron in her very excellent chapter, which is called Moral Lessons and Reforming Agendas: History, Museums, Science Museums, Contentious Topics and Contemporary Society. Cameron convincingly concludes that audiences want open debate and a range of perspectives. At the same time, they require museums to set moral standards and reforming agendas that can be used to understand and evaluate societal conduct. That takes us back to the Parramatta Female Factory. Cameron challenges just one of the many pieces of received wisdoms that hang around museums. Others include supposed maximum limits of text on a wall, or labels that average people will read. But such descriptions often emanate from art departments where powerful heads of designers call the shots and have significant influence on the final shape and content of exhibitions. Paula Hamilton and I at UTS did a large national project called Australians in the Past in the early 2000s, and we spent a lot of time talking to people about museums and their experiences there. And in the end, the message we got very clearly, and it's been documented and published about by Paula and I, is that people want to know the truth, and they want it to be told in a way that's clearly communicated, but they want to know the truth. And I think that's a very important lesson for a lot of us. The problem is, and I'll conclude on this comment, is that we do live in real worlds, and museums are part of political and cultural networks and institutions, and there are limits as to what one can do. And I think from my experience, it's often been a matter of trying to do as much as you can do in the environment, the political and cultural environment in which you find yourself, and to try and push the envelope as much as you can without tearing it to pieces. So I might leave it there, if that's all right, Kresno. If we just flip through a couple of the last slides, maybe.
Sure.
Yeah. One of the points I was going to make, but I don't want to take up any more time.
Yep.
I went and documented some graffiti places in Melbourne a year or two ago, and there are some wonderful historical and political graffiti pieces spread throughout a lot of back lanes in Melbourne. And these are the sort of things that if I was in Melbourne and I was working in a cultural institution, I'd be looking at engaging these incredibly powerful sites. If you want to move on to the next slide.
Yep.
In terms of open museums, there are dozens of laneways like this scattered with political and cultural and social issues and messages, and thousands of people travel through these avenues, these alleyways, these laneways all the time. You might want to go on to the next slide.
Next.
Thank you.
Yep.
And this is finally, this is in the Powerhouse Museum, one of the only institutions that actually has put on a fairly major exhibition on gay and lesbian history. Very brave to do something like this.
You're right.
And we have had a lot of, in Australia and in Sydney particularly, we've had a lot of political interference in some exhibitions, anyway, that's part of the landscape. So I'll stop there and hand back to you, Kresno. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. Yes, we move to question and answer. Probably someone will ask about museum or heritage or anything to Paul.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, Paul, can I ask you something about you mentioned about house museum? Is there any differences between house museum and historical house?
Not particularly. They're pretty much the same thing, but the differences between them can be quite significant. As I mentioned, Carisbrook in Lane Cove, which is a middle-class suburb in northern Sydney, has decided to freeze their house and only bring objects and furniture and other things in that are from the 1880s. And that's sort of made invisible the various and very significant changes that have taken place over time in this lovely historic building. There's a house in Nowra, which is in down south of Sydney in a regional area called Marugal. It's an 1880s two-storey farmhouse building that was modelled on an American style of farmhouse. And the curators that were given that house to interpret about 30 years ago decided not to freeze the house, but to leave it as it was given to them. It was donated to Sydney Living Museums, and they decided to freeze everything. So the television, the TV, the fridge, magazines in the room, everything's just pretty much left as the house, when the people passed away and left the house to the state government, it's just all there. And they use that to show how the house has evolved over time, and different influences with style, taste, culture, technology, a whole range of things from gas, candles to gas to electricity, Yeah.
Because in Indonesia here, historical house is mainly relating to some heroes. So I think, yeah, it's in Australia, I think it's more public than in Indonesia. It's more elite about someone who died or someone who's served for their country or for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have very grand houses like Vaucluse House in Sydney, which was the house of a powerful and rich colonial politician, and it looks a bit like a castle, and you get a ticket and you get taken through, and it's very nice. But we also have workers' cottages in the Rocks, that very important tourist area in the middle of Sydney. It's the oldest suburb in Australia. Tiny buildings. We have also archaeological digs in the rocks that show the footings and foundations of houses, and also in display cases, objects that have been dug up in the ground. So we have a very broad range of house museums, from the grand to the very humble.
Okay, this one question from Zulfa. Zulfa is one of the students of archaeology who passionately study about museum. She's also works in one of the national museum in Jakarta. Her question is, how do you see the future of museum in Indonesia, Paul?
That's a very it's a great question and very tricky. I've been to a number of the museums in Jakarta, and you took me to a couple, Kresno. I'm not sure politically how far they may be changed, but I would like to think that they become less anthropological, and that they tend to be a little bit 19th century or early 20th century, and some of our museums are still like that very much. But to probably engage more with publics, and it's not a matter of changing the museums themselves. You can still leave those brilliant old collections of regional. I think the one, I can't remember the name, but there's one where there are displays about a lot of islands and regions around Indonesia with different.
It's a national museum, I think.
Yes,
in the center of the city. Yeah,
and that as a cultural artifact in itself would be brilliant to interpret it without change. You wouldn't need to change it, but you could interpret it, and you could have people engaging with it from regions. And you could use digital technology to transform it without actually having to change it physically. And I think museums today, definitely in Australia, because of the digital revolution, that they need to be more than keeping places or repositories for objects. I think they need to engage with ideas, and they have to become places where people can talk about regional issues or a whole range of things. Libraries are in the same boat. Libraries here are in danger of disappearing because no one needs a library anymore. You can go online and get all the books from Gutenberg and all those other things. Same with museums. You can see the objects, you can go to digital collections. So they need to transform their own agendas and their own mission statements to do more than what is still essentially for most museums 19th century objectives and agendas.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Pak Noerhadi, any comment, Pak Noerhadi? This is Professor Noerhadi, Paul.
Hello, my name is Noerhadi. I would like to know, you were talking about public history of Australia. Where do you put the history of the indigenous people? Or do you have also a museum representing their lives, something like that? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, we do. Indigenous people are represented very well in the National Museum of Australia, and there are other museums. The Queensland Museum has a wonderful collection of Indigenous material. It's very well interpreted. Queensland had a very violent history of conflict and guerrilla warfare, and it's very well presented through that particular museum. The Northern Territory, which is it's a large area, but it has a very small population, also has some excellent museums that deal with that. And there are some very good small regional museums and local museums that actually engage with Indigenous history and black and white relations, basically. But it's very interesting, as I've done in the past, going through regional Australia, there are some places where you would think that those two histories of black and white never intersected. But there are other places where there has been some sort of historical and cultural difference where the cultures have come together, and it's much more sophisticated, blended histories where there is understanding of each other's perspectives. I went to an exhibition in Queensland years ago where a guy had written in a visitor's notebook that he'd lived in this town for 20 years as a child and young man, and had never understood the Indigenous history that was very strong and powerful in that area. So it's very diverse here, very, very diverse.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's another, we have, I think, 4 questions, Paul. One is from, Dani Tumbalaka. Dani Tumbalaka is a photographer who have a passion on history. He's asking 3 questions. Is there any data regarding the visitors of most of the museum, for example, in 2015 to 2019 before the pandemic? Is this a decline statistically, or what is the cause?
Prior to the pandemic, obviously, there's very few people were going, but they've opened up the museums more recently. There are people allowed to go back into most of them. There has been, and again, depending on the way in which the museum has decided to model its agenda and its practices, some museums, their visitation rates have gone up and others have gone drastically down. The Museum of Sydney opened in the early 1990s, and it decided to be postmodern, and it didn't have labels. And I had an academic colleague from the State University of Arizona who I took to the Museum of Sydney in the the early 2000s, and she had no idea what was happening in the museum, and she was a professional historian, because they had decided not to label, not to interpret, to let people just interact with objects and stuff. And unless you had a very, very intimate knowledge of the things you were looking at, you didn't know what was happening. And the Premier of New South Wales, Bob Carr, around 2002-03, visited the museum, and he was a historian by training, American historian, or historian of American history. And he made them go back to more traditional methods of display. Their numbers had dropped to under 300 or 400 a week in the middle of Sydney, in the biggest city in Australia. It was terrible. So I really do think it depends on the individual museums. Overall, I'd say museum visitation has probably dropped, and it's continuing to drop. And I think with the pandemic and the various responses, digitally and otherwise, we'll tend to see the visitation rates dropping away. And I think museums need in this country and in other places to think about that in terms of strategies of engaging publics and engaging people to interact with the museum. And I think that's about getting people to contribute, to reflect, to give them opportunities to contribute experiences or whatever to museums, but not have museums just being these monolithic institutions that have objects, 90% of which in a lot of museums are hidden in vaults and underground. The Smithsonian Museum of American History about a decade ago remodelled and refurbished. It closed for about a year, and they decided to put most of their collection in perspex and glass display cases that were built into walls in public areas. So now 95% of their collection is on display. You can walk past it in walls, whereas before 8 or 10% was on display. So I think that there are ways in which museums can generate new audiences and new interests in their activities. But they can't do what they were doing in the 20th century. They've got to do something new.
Okay, the second question is about the behavior of a shift in younger people in Australia about museum activities. Is there any shift of behavior from younger generation visiting museum, or just that nowadays, or just that they're neglecting the museum? Or
generally speaking, I think most younger people now, their museum visitations and experiences are virtual, generally. And a small proportion, from my experience, would visit museums because they wanted to engage with objects and see real things. But the digital revolution has changed a lot of that now, I think. Yep. They're still happy to go to them, but not physically.
Okay. Okay, the next question is from Karguna Purnamaharya, one of the students of the archaeology. He said, what is the most challenging conflict based on your experiences in dealing with museum?
It depends on the museum, but I think in the end, it's political environments and political context in which people work. Censorship is a major issue in museums in Australia, and often it's not overt, it's not head-on censorship. There is very covert censorship, and I think some people working in museums in Australia as elsewhere get to a point where they start self-censoring because they say, how far can I push the envelope without getting into trouble? So they self-censor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So they say, well, I can say this, but I can't say that, so I'll just say this, and then I won't get interference. So that there are very complex patterns of censorship and self-censorship happening, and I think that's a major issue. The other major issue, I think, in museums in Australia definitely now is resourcing. That a lot of museums now in our state, are on what's called efficiency budgets. So they cut the budget every year 1.5%. So the museum has to find revenue from somewhere else to fund its staff and its activities. And they do that by not putting on their own exhibitions or exhibitions important to local people or the state. They bring in blockbusters from America, like Star Wars.
Yeah, right.
And it doesn't cost them anything. They pay, they know they'll get a lot of people. But then you start thinking, well, why don't you just close the museum and open a movie cinema? So there are a lot of economic and political issues, and they've been made worse by the pandemic. For example, places like the Maritime Museum in Sydney have lost 40 to 50% of their income because visitors just aren't coming. I was there a few weeks ago with a colleague of mine, Stephen Gapps, who's a curator, and there was basically no one there. Yep. And yeah, people are scared because of the pandemic and whatever. And that is going to have not just short term, it will have medium and long term impacts on the culture of these places.
Yeah, next question is about exhibition from Punto Sidarto. She asked a question about how we choose between narrative communication or interactive communication, or can we be both in doing exhibition, something like that?
Great question, and absolutely. I think there's a need for both. I think curators, anthropologists, historians, political scientists, whatever their background, need to have professional input into things to do with museum exhibitions. But I think it's important to have areas in exhibitions that are interactive, that allow people to engage and to contribute their own experiences or link up with, connect their own experiences with particular issues, whatever, in an exhibition. It's a matter, I think, of balance, and I think both are perfectly acceptable. I would not want to go to the Museum of Sydney model in the 1990s when there was no interpretation, where there was no expert input. It was just, here's a lot of stuff in a cabinet and work it out for yourself. And you have little kids wandering around going, what the hell's happening here? You know, where am I?
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, this is another question, and I think it's relating to today's pandemic. This is from Hilman Handoni. A quick glimpse, museum in Indonesia missed the opportunity to address the pandemic that is currently being faced. There is no museum that collects today's artifacts. This represents the general view of museum people in Indonesia that's still stuck in the past. So there must be a quick shift on the paradigm so we don't lose that today's history. What's your advice? Is some kind of recording today's happening for the future, I think.
Absolutely. And again, an excellent question. I've got a young colleague of mine who I've done some writing with over the years, who is writing a chapter in a book that I'm co-editing at the moment called The History Industry in Australia. And she's writing about the impact of the pandemic on people in the present and how it changed her life and her work as a historian. And I think it's vital that we actually have portals or digital databases, repositories set up in cultural institutions and universities, museums, whatever, where we can collect a whole range of contemporary ideas, objects, experiences, photographs. I think things like Pinterest and platforms like that are wonderful, that they'll be incredible sources for historians and anthropologists and archaeologists in the future. I think we just need to make sure we're all doing those things and developing ways to capture that material rather than just let it disappear into the ether.
This I think there's more question, Paul. This is from Sinta Ridwan. She wants to ask a question about indigenous people in Australia. Is the Museum of Indigenous People specifically in Australia? How to present traditional and local history in 21st century? With more visiting interest about it. Who is the more interest in visiting the museum, I think? Foreigner or domestic tourists?
There are a lot of major exhibitions, and again, for example, in the National Museum of Australia, there's a permanent exhibition on First Nation, on Indigenous Australians, which again were a very, very large group of tribes. There were hundreds of them, 300 or 400 tribes of different languages and cultures, but they interacted across the country. There are people have traced, archaeologists and other people have traced, and historians have traced trade routes from Darwin to Melbourne, where people would meet up in different places at different times of the year or different years to exchange goods that you could only get in Northern Australia with goods you could only find in Southern Australia. So it's an incredibly complex interwoven web of movements of people. But there are some excellent exhibitions in different places. Who goes to visit them? Very diverse audiences. I think a lot of white Australians are active in going to those exhibitions and engaging with them. When I was at school, primary school in the 1960s and early 70s, Aboriginal history was very poorly taught. We all thought that Aborigines lived in the desert, basically, and there wasn't a great deal in museums, very little. The museums were largely ethnographic. It was only about their tools and spears. It wasn't really till the 70s and 80s that changed with the new social histories and women's history and, you know, Aboriginal history. So there is a lot of really good material around, a lot of good exhibitions, and a lot of people look at them. But Australia is still a country divided along race lines. It is a racist country in many ways, and there are still a lot of people who are racist and wouldn't attend museums or want to think about things like that. So we've got a long way to go. Australians have often prided themselves of being very fair and egalitarian, and they don't like to think that they're like Southern Americans or South Africans with apartheid. But we have a lot of history that we have to deal with. Our Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, called it black armband history, and he didn't want to know about that. He wanted to know about progress and prosperity and peace, whereas our history, as with all nations' histories, are very complicated and difficult.
Yeah. So do you think there's a future for museum in Australia or in the world?
I do, but I think they have to engage more creatively and in a little way, a little bit more, not radical in being crazy, but in pushing those boundaries and actually looking at an interesting, sophisticated cultural and social histories, not at simplistic views of what the world is, and leaving things a bit open-ended, not just black or white. So I do think there's a huge future.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Paul. Pak Noerhadi, is there any comment? Pak Nanu? No? Okay. I think that will be all, Paul. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate for your time. It's about 1 hour and a half. It's a way to go. It's time for you it's time for you to sip your wine.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again in hope to see you again in another discussion. So probably we have to find another theme or something like that about heritage, about anything about archaeology or historical, and then we can invite you again in the future.
That would be great. And there's some colleagues of mine who are really interesting. They're not old like me. They're doing a special issue of Public History Review on the statue wars.
Statue War, all right.
On the Statue War. And Kira Lindsay and Mariko Smith. And Mariko is an Indigenous woman who works at the Australian Museum, and Kira is a historian that works at UTS in the Centre for Public History. You might want to, I can give you their details, you might want to think about, because that's about objects and material culture, history, wars, a whole lot of stuff. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate
Lovely
it.
seeing you. There's no take
Before we finish, we have to record some photograph through Zoom. Okay.
Got me take off my glasses.
Yeah, you look younger than 10 years younger. So everybody can put up your camera, everybody, so you can see your faces. Buat teman-teman supaya bisa buka kameranya. Silakan buka kamera teman-teman supaya bisa terlihat semua. Ya. Udah? Udah? Yep.
Ya, tunggu sebentar ya Bapak Ibu, mohon ditahan senyumnya. 1, 2, 3. Mungkin ini akan makan waktu sekitar 30 detik sebentar ya Bapak Ibu. Tunggu.
Ada yang nggak bisa nih?
Tidak bisa apa?
Nggak bisa keluar mukanya.
Oh, di turn on aja start video, ada di bawah di dekat mic. Oke. Ada lagi yang mau buka kamera?
Ada lagi yang buka kamera? Silakan, Mas Dani. Bisa kok, Mas?
Nggak bisa.
Mas
bisa,
Dani dan Mas Billy ya?
Akhirnya bisa.
Udah.
Bisa. Oke, Mas Dani.
Oke, baik. Saya ulang ya. 1, 2, 3. Oke. Satu lagi. Bentar. 1, 2, 3. Ditahan senyumnya. Oke, terima kasih Bapak Ibu.
Terima kasih.
Thank you,
Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
I'll see you again. Please give my regards to Pauline. Yeah.
I will. Thank you very much. Lovely to talk.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Lu nanya ya Mas.